While German soldiers patrolled Rome, one ordinary-looking girl carried secrets that could have killed her, but she turned every checkpoint into her stage, because in 1944, the city had become a maze of fear, ruin, and whispers, where bombed piazzas lay in rubble, alleyways echoed with distant gunfire, and civilians moved cautiously past armed patrols. And in this tense city, 19-year-old Assunta, Lalla Finacchiaro, had begun a life she could never have imagined, a life in which her hands, once skilled only at sewing, now carried messages, maps, and intelligence that could shift the fate of hundreds hiding from the Nazi regime, and she did so armed only with her wits, courage, and the ability to appear harmless, a skill more powerful than any weapon in occupied Rome. And the morning of her first major mission started with rain-soaked cobblestones and smoke in the air, while German officers patrolled the checkpoints, their eyes cold and their helmets gleaming, and Lalla, her satchel carefully slung across her shoulder, rehearsed every gesture that might prevent her from being noticed. And as she approached the first checkpoint, time seemed to stretch, the rain dripping off her hood, the hum of distant artillery echoing through the streets, and the soldier barked, "Papers!" But with calm precision, Lalla opened her bag just enough to reveal a neatly folded military uniform she had been mending for a German officer, a perfect decoy hiding the real contents beneath. And the soldier glanced briefly and waved her through, oblivious to the deadly cargo, and she continued weaving through narrow alleys, ducking behind walls, placing letters in prearranged drop points, each one a tiny thread in the invisible network of the Italian resistance. And by midday, she had delivered several packages, each potentially containing intelligence that could save dozens of lives, all while memorizing patrol routes, noting suspicious figures, and blending seamlessly into the city, laughing gently with a street vendor, nodding politely to neighbors, because invisibility was survival, and courage was acting despite fear. And as evening approached, she rested briefly among the ruins of a bombed building, laying out the next set of letters, checking maps, visualizing her next routes, rehearsing the steps that might mean life or death. And in one particularly tense moment, a German officer grew suspicious and asked her to open the bag, and for a heartbeat everything froze, the rain masking the distant gunfire, the cobblestones slick, the city holding its breath, and Lalla lifted the flap, showing only the half-sewn uniform, and the officer nodded dismissively, satisfied, letting her go, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing, mind already planning the next delivery. And as night fell over Rome, with lamps reflecting on wet streets, she returned to her modest apartment, soaked and exhausted, but filled with purpose and resolve, understanding that she had become more than a seamstress, that she was now a vital link in the resistance, a clever and daring figure who could outsmart Nazis while carrying hope and danger in the same bag. And though she did not yet know the full scope of the missions ahead, the betrayals, narrow escapes, and clever tricks she would perform, she knew one thing for certain: tomorrow she would walk the streets again, carrying secrets, fear, and courage. And the story of the girl who would outsmart the Nazis had only just begun.
The morning after her first successful deliveries, Lalla awoke to a city shrouded in fog and smoke, the streets eerily quiet, as if Rome itself was holding its breath. And she knew immediately that today would not be like yesterday, because the intelligence she carried was more critical than ever, detailing German troop movements, supply routes, and the location of a weapons depot crucial to the partisans. And as she slung her satchel over her shoulder and stepped into the gray, misty streets, she could feel the weight of every life depending on her, the knowledge that a single misstep could lead not just to her death, but to the capture or execution of dozens. And the alleys seemed narrower, the shadows darker, the soldiers' boots louder, as she moved cautiously, ducking behind ruined walls, keeping her eyes on the patrols, memorizing their routes, their pauses, their glances, all while appearing as the ordinary seamstress she had perfected being, and at the first checkpoint, a soldier eyed her more closely than before, suspicious, his gaze lingering on her satchel, and Lalla's heart thumped like a drum in her chest, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the flap to reveal the same half-sewn uniform she had used yesterday, praying it would be enough. And the soldier barked something, gestured toward her bag, but then a shout from behind startled both of them, a delivery boy knocking over a crate in the alley, and the soldier cursed under his breath, waving her through to deal with the distraction. And Lalla exhaled silently, adrenaline coursing through her veins, and as she moved deeper into the city, she realized this mission was different, because she had to reach a resistance safe house on the far side of Rome, a route she had memorized only in her head, passing checkpoints with increased German presence, where soldiers now seemed to suspect that someone in the city was delivering intelligence. And as she neared a narrow alley that would allow her to bypass a heavily guarded intersection, she noticed a shadow moving against the wall, a man she didn't recognize, and instinctively slowed, pressed herself into the darkness, and realized too late that she had stumbled into a small patrol, their rifles trained, eyes sharp, their expressions cold and calculating. And for a moment time slowed, every heartbeat thunderous in her ears, the satchel on her shoulder suddenly feeling like a stone, the letters and maps burning against her side as if they knew the danger. And she had to think fast, because hesitation here would mean certain death. And she remembered a trick one of the resistance leaders had taught her, to act completely ordinary, to breathe, to speak as if nothing were wrong. And in a soft voice, she greeted the patrol with a polite buongiorno, keeping her hands visible, walking slowly, as if delivering a small package for a neighbor, the satchel swinging lightly, a casual weight that concealed its deadly contents. And one of the soldiers eyed her suspiciously, muttering to his comrade. But before they could react, a loud whistle from the street drew their attention, a child running after a stray dog, and Lalla seized the chance, weaving past the patrol with a grace born of desperation, heart hammering, and she didn't dare look back until she ducked behind a pile of rubble, breathing heavily, trying to calm the fear that had threatened to paralyze her, realizing that the city itself had been both her ally and her enemy in that moment, that luck and quick thinking had saved her. And as she continued toward the safe house, she thought about the people counting on her, the partisans preparing an ambush, the families hidden in basements who would live or die depending on the information she carried. And she forced herself to slow, focus, measure every step until she reached the small, nondescript doorway that led to the resistance hideout, slipping inside, satchel still secure, and only then allowed herself a small shiver of relief, knowing that today she had survived not just the streets, not just the soldiers, but the invisible danger of suspicion and circumstance. And as she handed over the letters and maps, the leader of the cell looked at her with a mixture of awe and concern, saying quietly, "You risk too much, ragazza," and she only smiled faintly, because fear and risk were now constants in her life, inseparable from the work she had chosen. And as the afternoon turned to evening, the safe house buzzing with whispered plans, Lalla helped organize the information, plotting routes, analyzing the intelligence, preparing for the next mission. And as she finally slipped back into the darkened streets toward her apartment, the city now glowing with faint lamplight reflecting off puddles from the morning rain, she realized that surviving today had required not only courage, but cunning, presence of mind, and the kind of nerve that few could sustain. And though she knew the Germans would be increasing patrols, that suspicion was spreading in Rome, that her life was becoming a constant balancing act between danger and duty, she felt a growing sense of purpose, a clarity that her small steps, her quiet courage, her ordinary appearance hiding extraordinary deeds could make a difference in this city and perhaps the entire country. And as she laid out the next set of letters and maps, plotting routes, rehearsing every gesture, every checkpoint, every possible encounter, she understood that the work she had begun would only grow more dangerous, more daring, and that the story of the 19-year-old seamstress who outsmarted the Nazis was just beginning, because each mission, each narrow escape, Each clever deception was preparing her for the next challenge, and Rome, with all its danger and beauty, would become her stage, her battlefield, and her teacher, and she was ready to play her part again tomorrow, carrying fear, hope, and courage in equal measure.
Lalla had barely caught her breath after her first successful deliveries when she sensed something was wrong. The morning fog hung heavy over the streets of Rome, but it wasn't the weather that made her heart race. It was the feeling of being watched, shadows moving in her peripheral vision, footsteps that didn't quite match the city's rhythm, and she knew patrols had grown more numerous, sharper, hunting for the spy who had eluded them all week. And as she rounded the corner into a narrow alley, she froze. 3 German soldiers stood there unexpectedly, and a 4th seemed to emerge from the other side. Their eyes searching, calculating, suspicion clear, and Lalla realized she had walked straight into a trap. Her heart thudded, adrenaline surged, but she forced herself to act, quickly scanning the ruined buildings beside her for an escape route, while the soldiers began approaching, talking and laughing, unaware of how close death was lurking. And every step she took could reveal the satchel heavy with documents that would cost her life if discovered. But she leapt behind a broken cart, breathing shallow, eyes darting, and spotted a narrow gap in a crumbling wall, leading to a side passage she had memorized days earlier, timing her move with precision as a soldier advanced, only to stumble over a loose stone with a loud crash that echoed through the alley, giving her the split second she needed, and she bolted, pressed close to the walls, ducking under low beams, nearly tripping in the damp rubble, cold rain splashing her face, heart hammering, yet legs carrying her through the narrow passage with millimeter-perfect steps. Soldiers now shouting behind her, their voices bouncing off the stone walls, but she melted into shadows, slipping onto a quiet street, breathless, trembling, satchel still secure at her side. And when she finally reached the unassuming doorway of the safe house, she pressed herself against the wall, gasping, alive, and handed over the documents to the resistance leader, who stared at her with a mix of awe and disbelief, muttering, "You truly risked your life today." And Lalla only nodded, still drenched in adrenaline, aware that this was only the beginning. Every successful delivery, every near capture, every minute death almost brushed against her had sharpened her, made her smarter, faster, more alert, and as she later slipped back through the rain-soaked streets toward her apartment, every dark corner both a threat and a possibility, she realized that even as an ordinary-looking 19-year-old seamstress, she had proven that cunning and courage could outwit heavily armed soldiers, and the story of the girl who outsmarted the Nazis had become even more legendary, a tale of survival, nerve, and heart amid the darkness of war, where every step could be her last. But every step was also proof that she was no longer just surviving. She was mastering the invisible game, turning fear into power, and making the city itself her dangerous, controlled stage.
A few days later, Lalla found herself walking through the narrow, rain-slicked streets of Rome again, the fog hanging low and thick, twisting familiar alleyways into shadows that seemed to follow her every step. And today's mission was unlike the previous ones, because she had to deliver a coded message to a partisan cell operating in the heart of the city, where German patrols had recently doubled, and every corner she turned could hide danger, every street a trap. And as she passed a deserted fountain, the glint of a rifle barrel caught her eye, a soldier standing half hidden behind a wall, and her stomach tightened, the satchel heavy against her side, filled with letters that, if discovered, could lead to the execution of dozens, including herself. But Lalla had learned to make fear her ally, to slow her heartbeat, to breathe carefully, to move as if she belonged, and she adjusted the scarf around her neck, shifted the satchel to hang naturally, and walked past the soldier with a calm that made her look like any other young woman running errands. Yet her mind raced, calculating every possible outcome if he became suspicious, and just a block ahead, she spotted a group of officers who seemed to be scanning the streets, searching for someone. and instinctively she ducked into a narrow alley lined with the ruins of buildings, her eyes catching the subtle markers placed by resistance members for safe passage. And as she followed them, she passed a doorway where a child played quietly, unaware of the danger outside, a brief reminder of what she was fighting for. And the tension didn't let up, because the message she carried contained details of a German supply convoy arriving that night, information that the partisans could use to sabotage weapons, destroy resources, and strike a blow against the occupying forces. And she had to reach the contact before sundown, timing every step with precision, her pulse thrumming, ears straining for the sound of approaching boots, eyes scanning every shadow. And when she finally reached a side street where the safe house was concealed behind a decaying facade, she hesitated just long enough to make sure the coast was clear, slipped inside, and handed the coded message to the leader of the cell, whose eyes widened as he read it, realizing immediately how critical the intelligence was. And he murmured a warning: "If they catch this girl, we all pay the price." And Lalla nodded, because she knew, yet again, that each mission carried impossible risk, and even a small mistake could unravel weeks of careful planning. Yet she felt a quiet, fierce pride, because she had survived, outsmarted the patrols, delivered the intelligence, and proved that a single, ordinary-looking young woman could play a role that seemed far beyond her age, training, or position. And when she left the safe house, returning through the rain-darkened streets toward her apartment, she moved with the practiced precision of someone who had become part of the city itself, blending with the other pedestrians, ducking into shadows when a patrol passed, memorizing routes for the future. And as she finally stepped inside her apartment, removing the damp scarf and coat, she allowed herself a brief moment of relief, because today she had survived, succeeded, and learned once more that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward when fear was all around. And in the quiet of her small room, as she carefully folded the letters for the next mission, she realized that each success, each clever trick, each narrow escape was building something more than her reputation. It was building the legend of the girl who would outsmart the Nazis, a legend that would grow with every mission, every delivery, every heartbeat, in the dangerous streets of Rome.
The morning air in Rome was thick with fog and danger as Lalla crouched in the shadows, watching the German supply convoy she had been tracking for days, her satchel at her side heavy with maps, letters, and small tools the partisans would use for sabotage. And every moment was a test of nerves, because a single misstep could cost her life, or worse, doom the men and women depending on her. And as the trucks rumbled closer, Lalla's pulse pounded in her ears, each echo of their wheels on the cobblestones amplified by the eerie silence of the surrounding streets. And when a guard shifted his rifle, scanning the alleys, she froze, pressed low against the rubble, heart racing, mind calculating her next move in fractions of a second, knowing that the slightest sound could betray her presence. And then, just as a German officer stepped into the alley unexpectedly, forcing Lalla to flatten herself against the damp stone wall, a stray dog barked in the distance, startling the soldiers and giving her the split second she needed, and she darted forward, weaving through narrow gaps, placing coded markers for the waiting partisans, slipping unseen under the very noses of those who could kill her with a single command. And she reached the prearranged drop point, a ruined doorway hidden in shadow, laying the maps and tools carefully so they would not be discovered prematurely, her hands trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline, aware that discovery now would mean certain death. Yet she worked with meticulous care, every movement deliberate, and just as the last package was secured, a patrol unexpectedly turned the corner, voices sharp, rifles raised, and Lalla held her breath, heart hammering violently, calculating escape routes, and in a move of pure instinct, she darted through a side passage littered with debris, stumbling but regaining balance, narrowly avoiding the soldiers' line of sight. And as she sprinted through the labyrinth of alleys, the shouts of the Germans growing fainter behind her, she felt a surge of triumph mixed with terror, knowing that she had just pulled off one of the most dangerous operations of her life, delivering crucial intelligence and materials while almost being caught. And when she finally reached the safe house, soaked, exhausted, trembling but alive, she handed over the tools and maps to the resistance leaders, who looked at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief, whispering, "You could have been killed." And she nodded,
silently acknowledging how close she had come to disaster, yet understanding that each narrow escape, each risk taken, made her more capable, more daring, more indispensable. And as she later retraced her steps through the rain-darkened streets toward her apartment, every shadow a possible threat, every echo a potential danger, she felt the strange exhilaration that only someone who has danced on the edge of death could know. The knowledge that she, a simple 19-year-old seamstress, had orchestrated a sabotage that could cripple the enemy, outsmarted heavily armed soldiers, and survived to tell the tale. And in that moment, Lalla realized the power of courage, intelligence, and instinct combined, understanding that her story, already legendary among the resistance, was growing, each daring mission shaping her into something extraordinary, a symbol of hope, nerve, and cunning in a city crawling with danger, where even a single girl could tilt the balance of war with nothing but wits, courage, and the sheer audacity to act.
A week later, Lalla found herself crouched in the shadows of a narrow alley near the edge of Rome, watching the German supply convoy she had been tracking for days, her satchel at her side, heavier than usual, with maps, letters, and small tools the partisans would need to sabotage the trucks. And the tension in the city was palpable. Every distant shout, every clatter of boots on cobblestones, making her pulse race as she memorized the guards' positions, the spacing between vehicles, and the timing of their movements, knowing that a single wrong step could mean execution, not just for her, but for the partisans who relied on the intelligence she carried. And yet, as she crouched in the mist, her young face calm, she felt a strange exhilaration, the same thrill that had driven her through checkpoints and alleys, because today she would play a part in an act that could cripple the enemy's operations in Rome, and she remembered the instructions whispered by the resistance leader the night before. Move quickly, stay invisible, distract the guards if needed, and never let them see you for what you really were, a young girl carrying the fate of dozens in her hands. And as she slipped closer, blending with shadows and debris, she spotted a guard glancing around nervously, his rifle catching the dim light, and she slowed, adjusted the satchel to hang naturally. And in that moment, she realized she would need more than luck. She would need cunning, improvisation, and the kind of nerve she had never imagined herself capable of. Because the patrols were sharper today, suspicion high, and any misstep would be fatal. And yet she moved with grace, placing small markings she had memorized along walls and corners, silent signals for the partisans waiting to strike, and then as a German officer approached, she ducked behind a broken cart, holding her breath, her heart hammering, the rain-slicked streets amplifying every sound, and the officer passed by without noticing her, distracted by a minor scuffle a few meters away, and Lalla exhaled slowly, continuing to her prearranged drop point, a ruined doorway where the partisans would collect the maps and tools, and she laid them down carefully, making sure everything was perfectly hidden, her fingers trembling slightly from fear and adrenaline, knowing that each piece of intelligence she delivered could mean the difference between success and disaster, life and death. And as she watched from the shadows, the partisans moved in quickly, loading their supplies, setting the stage for the night's sabotage, and she felt a surge of pride and terror combined. Because this was no ordinary delivery, this was an act that could change the course of events in Rome. And when the convoy finally rolled away, she melted back into the alleyways, retracing her steps with the same care, avoiding patrols, blending with the few civilians moving through the darkened streets, every sense on high alert until she reached her apartment, soaked from the rain, exhausted but alive, her hands shaking as she removed her coat and scarf, laying out the next letters and maps for the coming days. And in that quiet moment, she realized that each successful mission, each clever distraction, each narrow escape was building her skill, her confidence, and her reputation among the resistance, transforming the once ordinary seamstress into a young woman capable of incredible feats of courage, cunning, and stealth. And she knew that the path ahead would grow even more dangerous, that the Germans were likely on the lookout for her, and that every delivery, every mission would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. Yet she was ready, because she had already survived the impossible, outsmarted the enemy, and learned that even a single girl could become a force capable of shaping events in the streets of occupied Rome.
And with that thought, she allowed herself a brief, exhausted smile, because the story of the girl who would outsmart the Nazis was only growing, one daring mission at a time.
A few days after the sabotage mission, Lalla sensed the city had shifted, a subtle tension in the air, whispers of increased German patrols and new informants crawling through Rome. And as she stepped out into the rain-darkened streets, her satchel tight against her side, she felt the weight of more than letters and maps. She carried the lives of the partisans who trusted her, and today, something felt different. A faint sense of being watched that made her pulse quicken. And as she turned down a familiar alley, she spotted a figure leaning casually against a wall, someone she hadn't seen before, but whose gaze lingered too long, calculating, searching, and a cold realization hit her. Betrayal. Someone in the network must have given her position away, and fear gripped her for the first time in weeks, a sharp, icy edge cutting through the adrenaline she had relied on. Yet she forced herself to calm, remembering everything the resistance leaders had drilled into her. Stay invisible, move ordinary, trust no one, and think 3 steps ahead. And so she continued, pretending to adjust her coat, her face relaxed, body language casual, but her mind racing, analyzing every shadow, every reflection, every possible exit from the alley. And then, at the corner, a German officer stepped out from the fog, rifle in hand, eyes narrowing. And she froze, but only for a heartbeat, before she ducked behind a stack of crates, heart hammering, mind calculating, recalling a narrow passage she had discovered days before, one that led through the rubble of a bombed building and out to a quieter street. And with precision, timing, and nerves of steel, she slipped through it, each step silent, her satchel barely moving, the soldier calling after her, curses echoing, but too late. And she emerged into an empty side street, breathing hard, adrenaline surging, knowing that today she had survived a betrayal, avoided capture, and outsmarted the enemy once again. And when she finally reached the safe house, damp, shivering, and exhausted, she handed over the letters and maps she carried, recounting the encounter only in vague terms, because the fewer knew of the near capture, the safer the network would remain. And as she plotted the next routes, rehearsed new drop points, and memorized patrol patterns with renewed intensity, she realized that betrayal was now part of her reality, a constant shadow in the dangerous streets of Rome, and that every mission from now on would require not just courage and skill, but an almost instinctive ability to anticipate deception, to turn fear into advantage, and to survive against impossible odds. And as she lay in her modest apartment that evening, wet and exhausted but alive, she understood something profound, that a single, ordinary-looking girl could continue to outsmart the Nazis, navigate betrayal, and strike crucial blows for the resistance, and that the story of Lalla, the seamstress who had become a spy, was no longer just about courage. It was about survival, ingenuity, and an unbreakable will to fight in a city crawling with danger. And she knew, with certainty, that tomorrow would bring even more challenges, more missions, more tests of cunning and bravery, and that she would face them all with the same determination that had carried her through each narrow escape and perilous mission so far, because Rome had become her stage, and she had learned how to play it better than anyone could ever suspect.
By early 1945, the city of Rome had grown even more dangerous. German patrols tightened their grip, suspicion ran high, and whispers of informants made every shadow a potential threat. Yet Lalla knew she could not stop. She had been entrusted with intelligence that could cripple the occupying forces in the city, and today her mission was the most daring yet, because she had to infiltrate a heavily guarded office where German officers kept detailed records of troop movements, supply schedules, and the locations of key installations, and one slip could mean instant execution. Yet as she stepped into the rain-soaked streets, satchel slung tightly, scarf shielding her face, she felt a strange calm, a confidence born from months of surviving impossible situations, and she moved through familiar alleys with precision, timing her steps with the patrols, memorizing every glance, every shuffle of boots on the cobblestones, until she reached a side street she had reconnoitered days before, a narrow entrance leading to the building, and slipping inside, she was met with dim light, the faint smell of paper and ink, and the hum of a city that seemed miles away. Yet above her, footsteps echoed, and she froze, heart hammering, knowing that discovery would be fatal.
Yet she reminded herself that fear was a tool, sharpening her senses, guiding her movements, and she moved quietly, quickly, locating the files she needed, memorizing details, snapping photos in her mind of every chart, every note, storing the critical intelligence she carried in memory alone, because to carry it physically would be too dangerous. And just as she was about to leave, a German officer entered the room, voice sharp, demanding to know who was there, and for a terrifying moment, Lalla's mind raced for an escape, scanning the room for anything she could use to her advantage. Then, remembering a loose shuttered window at the back, she ducked, slid quietly through the narrow gap, the cold night air hitting her face, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing as she ran through the alleys, blending with shadows, silent, careful, precise. And when she finally reached the safe house, breathless, soaked, yet triumphant, she handed over her memorized intelligence to the resistance leaders, whose eyes widened as they realized the scope of what she had achieved, and they whispered, almost reverently, "You risked everything for this ragazza." And she only nodded, because she had come to understand that courage was not about reckless bravery, but about calculated risk, about turning fear into strategy, about surviving when survival seemed impossible. And as she returned through the empty streets toward her apartment, each shadow a possible threat, each step a silent test of nerve, she felt a strange thrill, the knowledge that she had pulled off the most daring mission of her young life, outsmarting the enemy once more, and proving that even a 19-year-old seamstress could infiltrate heavily guarded positions, memorize critical intelligence, evade capture, and live to fight another day. And as she finally entered her modest apartment, shaking off rain, exhaustion, and tension, she laid out her plans for the next days, aware that the Germans would soon be on higher alert, but knowing she had already set a standard for daring, cunning, and invisible heroism that would define her, and that the story of the girl who outsmarted the Nazis, the seamstress turned spy, was reaching its climax. Her courage, intelligence, and ingenuity now legendary among those who fought in the shadows. And Rome itself, with its alleys, checkpoints, and ruined piazzas, had become both her stage and her proving ground, a city that had tested her at every turn and had been beaten not with weapons, but with cleverness, nerve, and an unbreakable will.
The spring of 1945 brought a tense hush over Rome, the city holding its breath as rumors of the Allied advance grew louder. Yet the German soldiers in the streets remained dangerous, patrols relentless, suspicion high, and Lalla knew this would be her most critical mission yet, because the intelligence she carried now could help the resistance coordinate with the Allies, strike decisive blows, and finally weaken the occupying forces before the city could be locked down entirely. And as she stepped out of her modest apartment in the gray dawn, satchel slung tightly across her shoulder, the cobblestones wet with overnight rain, she felt a strange mixture of fear and resolve, knowing that the streets she had navigated countless times before were now more dangerous than ever, every shadow a potential enemy, every footstep echoing threats she could not yet see. And yet she moved forward with the calm that had saved her life so many times before, blending seamlessly with civilians, keeping her posture ordinary, her eyes casual, her mind sharp, memorizing patrols, observing patterns, noting every officer. And when she reached the checkpoint near the bombed piazza where she had narrowly escaped weeks earlier, the tall officer with the calculating gaze recognized her for a fleeting moment, suspicion flickering in his eyes. But she tilted her head slightly, adjusted her scarf, and smiled faintly, appearing perfectly harmless, and he waved her through, oblivious to the satchel holding intelligence that could change the course of the resistance. And as she slipped into the alleyways leading to a safe house on the far side of the city, she felt the pulse of the city beneath her feet, the weight of every life relying on her. And when she finally handed over the letters, maps, and memorized details to the partisan leaders, they stared in awe at the precision, the daring, the nerve it must have taken for a single girl to move through the occupied streets again and again, outsmarting soldiers, avoiding capture, and delivering intelligence critical to the survival of their entire network. And the leader whispered, almost reverently, "You have done more than anyone could have imagined." And Lalla only nodded, exhausted, wet, and trembling slightly, but exhilarated, because she knew that today marked not just another mission, but the culmination of months of courage,
ingenuity, and invisible heroism. The proof that a single, ordinary-looking young woman had become one of the most effective agents in the resistance, shaping events through cleverness, nerve, and sheer determination. And as she walked home through the rain-darkened streets, slipping past the last checkpoints, shadows stretching long in the morning light, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The first day she had walked past a German soldier with documents that could have killed her, the narrow escapes, the betrayals, the sabotage missions, the careful memorization of enemy movements, and the countless hours spent blending in while carrying secrets too dangerous for anyone else to handle. And in that quiet moment, Lalla realized something profound, that courage was not measured in weapons or armies, but in the willingness to face fear again and again, to risk everything for the sake of others, and to use one's mind as a weapon, sharper than any blade, more precise than any bullet. And as she stepped back into her apartment, removing her coat, damp hair plastered to her forehead, she allowed herself a small, exhausted smile, knowing that Rome, battered, scarred, and haunted by war, had been her stage, her teacher, and her proving ground, and that the story of the seamstress who had outsmarted the Nazis was now complete, not because the war had ended, but because she had survived, succeeded, and left a legacy of daring, intelligence, and courage that would be remembered by those who had lived in the shadows of occupied Rome. And though she was still just 19, she knew she had become more than a girl. She had become a symbol of hope, ingenuity, and unbreakable spirit, proof that even in the darkest times, one ordinary person could change history, one daring mission at a time.